Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. So they've been around for decades. You touch billions of them every day, but it's only in the past couple of years conversations around semiconductors have moved from the tech realm to everyday politics and public discourse. And when you talk about it, it's almost inevitable that semiconductors and Taiwan are said in the same breath. So in today's show, we'll be taking a look at how this critical piece of technology could reshape global power structures, and what would happen if Taiwan lost its semiconductor edge. In New York for this discussion, we have Chris Miller, who's an associate professor of history at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and the author of Chip War, a book that I've just finished. It's been described as a non-fiction thriller chronicling the evolution of semiconductors and the geopolitics around it. And here in Taipei, Jeremy Huai-Che Chiang, Associate Research Fellow at the Foundation for Future Generations, and has also worked for the US computer giant IBM and Taiwanese giant Foxconn. So Chris, I'm going to start with you. I believe you started writing this book before the pandemic, or what surfaced as the pandemic crunch, and it revealed to the masses how fragile the semiconductor supply chain was, and probably before it was popular to talk about semiconductors. Why did you choose to focus on chips, being a historian?
Well, I came to realize that semiconductors were really at the core of the balance of power in the modern world, whether we're talking about economic influence, military power, geopolitical influence. In fact, you can't understand the shape of the world today without putting semiconductors at the core of your analysis. And most of us, although we rely on chips for all of our daily lives, from our PCs to our smartphones and dishwashers and coffee makers, we never actually buy chips ourselves. They're embedded deep in devices. And so we really don't think about the semiconductors without which the modern world simply couldn't function.
And Jeremy, what's become so apparent of the past year, almost to anyone who has a passing knowledge of semiconductors, is that all roads seem to lead to Taiwan. Why is that?
Gradually transitioned from an agricultural-based society to a, pretty much a giant in this field, from your electronics to all, the key components within, everyday tech products. A lot of them are made by Chinese manufacturers, either domestically or all their manufacturing sites in China or elsewhere in Mexico and other countries.
For now and for the foreseeable future, Taiwan will play an absolutely critical role. If you look at, in particular, TSMC, which is the biggest and the most technologically advanced chip maker in Taiwan, there are just extraordinary market forces that will likely keep TSMC a really major player for many years to come. First off, the scale that TSMC has behind it. Second, the level of technology that the company has developed. All of these factors mean that whatever the policy choices of different governments, Taiwan is going to be a major player in the ecosystem for as far into the future as we can realistically predict.
And for some countries, that's a little worrying. Let me take you to this. Now, as Chris said, these chips are found in almost all electronic items and even weapons. And that is troubling for the US. It's scrambling to bring manufacturing back onshore, particularly because almost every high-level weapon in the US has semiconductors, and often they will relate back to Taiwan. So among the other initiatives, it is enlisting the help of Taiwanese chip giant TSMC. Our reporter James Chater gives us some more background on the US efforts to onshore chip production in Arizona.
This is Taiwanese chip giant TSMC's $40 billion facility in the US state of Arizona.
This state-of-the-art facility behind us is a testimony that TSMC is also taking a giant step forward to help build a vibrant semiconductor ecosystem in the United States.
The two factories here make up TSMC's largest ever overseas investment, and combined, they're one of the largest foreign direct investments in US history. Semiconductors are used in everything from household appliances to computers, from smartphones to cars. And over the past 2 years, many industries have been hit by a global shortage of the high-tech chips. These factories are intended to help ease the chip crunch, the result of supply chain disruptions during the pandemic. But it's also seen as part of a geopolitical tussle to control the production of semiconductors, the brains of modern electronics. TSMC's Arizona plant has already secured some big customers like Apple and Nvidia. The facility will begin mass production of 4nm chips at their first Arizona fab in 2024, and 3nm chips at the second fab in 2026. The smaller the nanometer, the more advanced the chip. But TSMC in Taiwan is racing ahead, hoping to start mass production of even more advanced 2nm chips in 2025. Howard Zhang and James Shater for Connected.
Jeremy, why is Taiwan's government on board with TSMC's Arizona plant? And more importantly, why is TSMC so willing to do this?
I think on the Chinese government side, I think, President Tsai has made it very clear that they're very bought in the idea of democracy chips and also Taiwan's increased economic and also industrial linkage with so-called like-minded countries, namely democracies in US and also European countries, but also neighboring Japan and even Korea. They've invested quite some efforts at making the so-called chip alliance, Chip 4 or Fab 4 coming into place, and also related economic dialogues with the US. Of course, TSMC is a private company; they can't interfere in their affairs. But when TSMC did go abroad and invest in Arizona and also other places, for example, in Japan, they also saw it, as an effort which was in the same direction which they intended, which was increased collaboration between democratic countries.
Chris, what's your take on this? Do you think the Arizona fab is the way to go for the U.S.?
Well, I think the U.S. is trying to build out its production capacity in a number of different ways. The CHIPS Act, which the U.S. government funded last year, is just in the early processes of implementation, but it's likely to provide funds to a number of different companies, some American, some from other countries, to build new facilities in the U.S. And so the TSMC facility in Arizona is likely to be just one of several new facilities opening up. And I think the key to the facility will be to ensure that it finds customers who are interested in producing with TSMC in Arizona as well as in Taiwan. And so I think we're going to have to wait and see to some extent how customers prefer to divide up their production between different TSMC facilities in Arizona and in Taiwan.
As we heard in that report, some of the big names have already committed to the or are hoping to get chips from that Arizona plant. Jeremy, is that in any way a threat maybe to Taiwan, possibly, if this whole idea increases in the fact that more facilities are onshored in the US? Is that a possibility in the near future?
I think, TSMC's clients or, other Chinese semiconductor manufacturing firms' clients will still, have Taiwanese firms produce their chips in Taiwan for the foreseeable future, at least a proportion of it. Of course, they would also want to hedge, their bets a little bit. For example, having a certain percentage produced at other sites, for example, in the US, maybe a potential future site in Europe or even Japan. It's just a part of everyday risk management in the corporate world. And also, I think they would also, they have been ongoing discussions in the supply chain about, paying a premium price, for chips manufactured in places where production costs may be higher, for example, Arizona. So I think that discussion is pretty much ongoing in the industry. And I think Taiwan, as a manufacturing site and as the birthplace of so many of these firms, that role is still going to be there. That role is still pretty much going to be, very prevalent and influential towards this industry's development in the future.
Before I go into the countries that are trying to catch up with Taiwan, and perhaps, the U.S. at one point was one of the lead producers of chips and now trying to kind of narrow the gap, I just want to go back to you, Chris, for some context here. And very briefly, and I know this is probably not so easy, how did the U.S. manage to lose that lead or lose being that leader in manufacturing?
If you look at why the U.S. has fallen behind in terms of manufacturing leading edge chips, the story really isn't about the US. The story is about TSMC and Taiwan racing ahead of the rest of the world. It raced ahead of Japanese rivals and Korean rivals and European rivals too. So it's really a story of TSMC's extraordinary track record of delivering a new manufacturing technology year after year with hardly any slip-ups. That explains why TSMC is currently capable of producing the most technologically advanced processor chips.
Well, the US isn't alone in wanting to bring chip production home. A number of other countries are steaming ahead with huge financial packages to lure semiconductor companies to set up shop there. We partnered up with Asianometry, the Taiwan-based YouTube channel focused on business and technology, which tells us about some of Taiwan's key competitors.
Let us take a look at Taiwan's leading global semiconductor competitors. What are our criteria? First, government and policy support, not just money, but also roads, red tape, electricity, and water. Second, industrial experience and a prolonged history of semiconductor or electronics manufacturing. Third, an indigenous industrial leader. Fourth, demand structures, who's buying your semiconductors, government, computing, automobile, telecommunications, consumer electronics market, so on. And finally, talents. I would put the US and South Korea into the first tier of Taiwan semiconductor competitors. The United States, a global flagship in Intel, and a comprehensive ecosystem up and down the value chain. Some of the industry's best and biggest semiconductor chip designers and vendors are headquartered in the US. It is also the biggest consumer electronics, computing, and military market. The United States is especially dominant in semiconductor research, and the American government has been heavily supportive of its semiconductor sector. The $50 billion CHIPS Act continues this tradition. On the downside, the United States has had trouble finding enough highly educated talents competing with many lucrative tech giants. Labor expenses are higher than what you can find in Asia. South Korea, their chaebol-led strategy is extremely aggressive, and the Korean semiconductor industry is the world leader in memory. Samsung Foundry is the second largest foundry in the world. Notably, they have adopted gate-all-around transistor structures into their latest 3nm process. And of course, because it is Samsung, the South Korean government has pledged billions of dollars, not only in tax rebates but also infrastructure and workplace training. As I mentioned before, TSMC's biggest competitor has long been Samsung in South Korea rather than the smaller fabs in China. The Tier 2 countries are making substantial investments into moving up the first tier. First is China. China hosts a strong flagship leader in a variety of semiconductor sub-industries, SMIC and logic, BOE technology and OLED, and Yangtze memory and memory. They're all technologically advanced. Even without access to EUV, SMIC has managed to produce very sophisticated chips at the near leading edge. And technology-wise, Yangtze memory is as good as Samsung or Micron. While recent American trade restrictions are troubling, there is a substantial chance that the Chinese manage to dominate markets like silicon carbide or gallium nitride. Niche markets, but very critical to certain forward-looking industries like EVs and green tech. Japan had once been the world's semiconductor leader, particularly in the memory market during the 1980s. Japan still has many semiconductor factories today, many of which are strong in niche areas. Sony is, for instance, the world leader in image sensor chips. Furthermore, the country's suppliers are critical. Tokyo Electron and Shin-Etsu are global leaders and perform leading-edge research. TSMC is tapping into that expertise with one of their R&D centers there.
Well, for the full version of the Asianometry research, which includes Tier 3 countries and other smaller players, do go to our YouTube channel. So, Chris, do you think South Korea has the ability to surpass Taiwan in the near future, given the amount of money it has, its lead already that it has in narrowing that gap, and the fact that there is a huge political will behind it?
Well, it's certainly possible, and the difficulty in predictions in the chip industry is that every single year companies at the leading edge need to roll out a new process technology that is technologically very challenging, really pushing the boundaries of what physics makes possible. So it's certainly conceivable that Samsung, which is the most advanced producer of processor chips in South Korea, could leap ahead of TSMC, especially if there were to be some sort of mistake at TSMC. But I think most people in the industry would bet that TSMC retains its leading position, at least over the next couple of years.
And Jeremy, when we talk about TSMC retaining its leading position, having worked in the corporate sector yourself, is there that conversation about South Korea catching up? Are they really that worried, or do they feel like, look, we've got so much of a lead, we're probably going to be able to adapt to the next thing before anyone can come near us?
I think the conversation surrounding Taiwan's competition with Korea has always been very interesting because it's not only about semiconductors, it's about electronics, it's about entertainment industry. It's pretty about, every industry that Taiwan and Korea both have. But I think in recent years, observers have, recognized that there have been some, new areas of collaboration because there has been a natural competition process that has brought out, winners and losers in both countries' industries. For example, nowadays Taiwan's IC design is much stronger than Korea's. Taiwan also produces, passive components on edge with the Japanese. Whereas, for example, if you look at Korea's electronic industry, not only its semiconductor industry, Samsung, LG are leaders, and also their display screen technology. So I think there has been a lot of collaboration, not only competition. Well, of course, if we're looking only specifically at leading edge logic chips, TSMC and Samsung are pretty much in competition with each other.
And Chris, one of the points that was brought out during that report is the fact that what would hold the U.S. back is talent, and that it lacks the talent it needs to advance at a faster pace. Why is that?
Well, there's many different types of talent that are necessary for different types of the semiconductor production process. The people who are skilled at design aren't necessarily skilled at the manufacturing side. I would say the U.S. has tended to invest more in chip design skills over the past couple of decades, in part because there are some very big chip design companies that have done that. It's invested less in manufacturing than countries like Taiwan or Korea that have bigger chip manufacturing bases. And that's made it more difficult to scale up cutting edge production in the U.S. because the base of people that have experience working in those types of facilities is smaller than in Taiwan or in Korea.
And so, Jeremy, do you see a lot of Taiwanese experts moving to the U.S. given the right package?
I think, the factors influence semiconductor professionals, whether that person would want to move from Taiwan to the U.S. There's a lot of factors. For example, he might have his, family in Taiwan, but he also might be thinking about his children's education. So then maybe the U.S. will have certain pull factors. I think so far, mostly the people that are moving from TSMC's fabs in Taiwan to Arizona, most of them are young, maybe in their 20s, 30s. And, some of them are thinking about rotating, gaining that international experience in Arizona for some years. Some of them are thinking about permanent, immigration. From the internet, discussions that we've seen, it's still pretty much everything is in process. Some of them are trying to attain green cards. Others, are just trying to adjust to, local workplace culture. So I think it's still pretty much ongoing at this moment.
So this brings me to one of the points of this conversation. It's what happens to Taiwan if it doesn't have the chip industry or it doesn't have that lead. I'm going to start with some numbers here. Taiwan's highly advanced chip industry accounted for about 20% of the country's GDP last year, with TSMC taking around 10% of that. Given these numbers, let me bring it back to you two.
I think Taiwan's economic success story has pretty much been tied with the electronic industry, not only the semiconductor industry. So of course, if you take out that entire industry, it's not only about people employed by the industry, but also basically, Taiwan's entire economy. It's about real estate. It's about retail. It's pretty about everything. But of course, then the challenge for Taiwan is, the industry is bound to have competition. Competition between different firms, competition between different countries. There will be a time that when sometimes, Taiwanese firms or the industry isn't leading, then if a lot of these additional values captured by other countries, and if Taiwan is hedging too much of its bets on this particular industry, then there are bound to be some pitfalls. So I think the Taiwanese government, also industry, have been thinking about this question for some long time. They're thinking about new industries where Taiwan can invest in. Software has not been Taiwan's strong suit, so the government has been encouraging investment in that area for some time. Biotech is also a very growing field. Taiwanese firms have been putting a lot of effort, but success stories so far have not been that prevalent.
Can you tell us about TSMC's ability to go smaller?
Well, it seems like we've got at least a half decade, perhaps longer, in the continuation of the ability to shrink the circuitry on advanced semiconductors. But if at some point it does become impossible to shrink them any further, that will be a problem not just for Taiwan, but for the entire world, because all of the computing advances that we've taken advantage of over the past half century have been driven by the ability of companies like TSMC to produce ever more advanced and precise circuits on tiny silicon chips.
Right. And another point of concern is the idea of, I guess, weaponry, the fact, and this is where the whole geopolitics rift comes in. Then where does that leave us in the sense of sharing knowledge, Chris, when you're talking about defense?
Well, I think what you see right now, the trend over the last 5 to 7 years has been much more concern about knowledge sharing when it comes to advanced computing, precisely because the weapon systems of the future will increasingly rely on advanced computing capabilities. And here we're talking not so much about the chips on military systems, though that's important, but also the chips in data centers that are training military systems and intelligence systems to act semi-autonomously or to apply artificial intelligence to military uses. And insofar as all of the world's major militaries are betting on AI to transform the way they operate over the coming decades, chips will be absolutely critical to the training and deployment of those artificial intelligence systems.
And in Taiwan, there is another layer of this, which is not just about the weaponry, but it's about the whole idea of the semiconductor industry helping Taiwan's national defense. Now, there are fears that other countries eroding its dominant position could jeopardize Taiwan's economic, as we mentioned, and national security. And particularly to what many describe as Taiwan's Silicon Shield. Now, Stephen Ezel, who's the vice president of the think tank Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, tells us if this fear is grounded.
Well, there are, as you say, there are conflicting views of the reality of the Silicon Shield, and or even what precisely is meant by the notion of a Silicon Shield itself, right? On the one hand, some interpret the Silicon Shield to mean simply that the great importance of Taiwanese semiconductor sector to the global economy, and thus to China's own economy, means that China would never conceivably undertake any kind of behaviors that might threaten that supply and thus significantly disrupt the global economy to China's own detriment. Now, there are others who believe that as opposed to being a shield, it's actually an attractor. It's a big giant orb, which China would like to get its hands on.
So where do you stand on this, Jeremy?
I think the whole discussions around Silicon Shield has been very interesting. I think, according to Craig Addison's original argument about the Silicon Shield, it has never been about, for example, a particular leader firm such as TSMC or Taiwan having, a large percentage in producing advanced node chips. It has only been about, Taiwan being such a huge player in electronics and semiconductors. Any military invasion of Taiwan is bound to create ripples and also massive friction across the global economy. That argument still stays today. And I think, even if Taiwan wasn't, that big of a player in this field today, I think that, that global economic effect will still be pretty much felt. But I think the second question would be that, is there really a Silicon Shield? I mean, will Xi Jinping or other Chinese leader, hesitate about invading Taiwan because Taiwan is such a big player in this field? I think, it does impose some costs, but if you look at, statements put forward and also discussions within China, I think first and foremost, invasion of Taiwan or so-called reunification has always been about nationalism, has always been about identity, has been more about politics than economics. Of course, there might have been some fringe actors or commentators saying that taking back Taiwan would be a boost for China's semiconductor industry, but that has never been at the center of discussion about Taiwan within China. And also, I think people in Taiwan are also they're very cognizant about that too. I don't think they think that having TSMC or any other tiny semiconductor firm will be a reason for them to be calm about their national defense. I think they've only recognized that TSMC or Taiwan semiconductor industry means that, other countries would also care about Taiwan, not only related to, it being a like-minded partner in terms of democracy with other countries, but also about, Taiwan as an economic partner and how innovation of Taiwan will be also bad for other countries as well.
And Chris, what are your thoughts on the Silicon Shield? Does it protect Taiwan or make it more vulnerable?
Well, I agree with Jeremy's analysis, and I think it's worth noting that the U.S. Security guarantees for Taiwan were put in place before the first semiconductor was invented. The U.S. has been helping to defend Taiwan since 1949. The first chip was invented in 1958. So for the U.S., this is about a lot more than just semiconductors. Taiwan is important for all of the reasons that Jeremy set out. And so I think it's reductive to say that Taiwan's friends are interested in security simply because of one company or one type of technology. The reality is that there's a whole lot more at stake.
And that's all the time we have for this episode of Connected. Thank you to both my guests, Chris Miller and Jeremy Huai-Che Chiang, for sharing their experience and opinions. If you'd like to see the full versions of the videos we played during the show, you can always visit our YouTube channel. And while you have your phone out, do check out our website, TaiwanPlus.com. I'm Divya Gopalan. Stay connected.